Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into something a little less comfortable, specifically a 1,000-year-old robe that smells faintly of the Mediterranean stale vinegar and ambition. You're standing in the great palace of Constantinople, the marble cool beneath your bare feet. The lamps are dim, the walls shimmer with mosaics, and everywhere you look there's just purple. Deep, rich, almost absurdly dramatic purple. Curtains, cushions, garments, even the ink on the scrolls glows with a regal plum hue. You can't help but notice how the guards' uniforms look like they've been soaked in grape jelly and dried in the sun. Welcome to the Byzantine Empire, and welcome to your new job as a humble, slightly underpaid assistant to a palace dye master. You'll mostly be carrying buckets, sloshing ones. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also drop your location and the current time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't really think about colors much in your modern life. Sure, you might debate between cool gray and cloud white for a new wall or squint at 20 shades of blue in a clothing store, but it's rare that a color means everything. In Byzantium, though, purple wasn't just a shade. It was destiny. It was power divine, favor, inheritance, threat, promise. It was the ultimate flex. The term born in the purple porphyrogenitos comes from this world. It didn't mean someone had a good fashion sense. It meant they were born in a literal, purple-draped room in the imperial palace reserved for royal births. That color wrapped the very idea of legitimacy in the empire. If you weren't born in that room under those curtains, tough luck. You could be a genius, general, a scholar, a demigod for all anyone cared. No purple room, no throne. And where did all that purple come from? Snails, of course. Tiny, unassuming sea snails from the eastern Mediterranean. The Murex brandaris and Murex trunculus, to be exact. These creatures, which look like someone gave a rock anxiety and spines produced a little gland filled with a mucus that after considerable suffering and smell could be transformed into a radiant, long-lasting purple dye. You don't crush one snail and walk away with a royal cloak. It took tens of thousands of snails to produce even a few grams of usable dye. You'd haul baskets of the things up from the shore, crack their shells open. Some accounts say you poke their glands with a needle first fun, and then let the juice ferment under the sun, for days, possibly weeks. The result, an awful, almost mythic smell, and eventually a dye so permanent that it could survive centuries in fabric. The process was so valued and secretive that it became state-controlled. The Byzantine emperors treated purple the way modern governments treat nuclear codes. Unauthorized use wasn't just illegal, it was treason. If you were caught wearing imperial purple, you didn't get a fashion citation. You got dead. Or worse, exiled to a coastal dye works where your job would be shoveling fermenting snail juice until your hair turned green. There are records of strict inventories with bureaucrats noting how many pounds of dye had been produced, stored, or used. Even the robes of high-ranking church officials were sometimes pulled back if the purple was too purple. One monk, writing a century later, said that the color was so intense, so vivid, it frightened the sun. Historians still argue whether this was poetic hyperbole or an accurate depiction of just how unnatural and blinding the best Tyrian purple really was. And here's a weird fringe fact for you. There's evidence that dogs were once used to help identify which snails had the richest dye glands, something about their sense of smell, picking up on the precursors. A four-legged quality control team. Whether this is true or just a case of medieval people really liked including dogs in every story is still debated. But back to you standing here in this imperial chamber. You watch as a robe is unrolled before the emperor. It's heavy, luxurious, a kind of dark crimson that shifts in the light toward violet wine plum and something beyond something almost glowing. The emperor nods. This one will do. It will signal to anyone who sees it that he alone rules with divine favor, that he alone holds the throne. That his garments, unlike yours, still slightly damp from your bucket duties, are soaked in authority. It's beautiful, it's expensive, it's utterly impractical, and it's about to cause a whole lot of trouble, because the snails, they're not infinite, and the coastlines, they're changing, and the people who know how to make this dye, they're starting to vanish or sell their secrets elsewhere. You're going to learn over the coming hours just what happens when an empire addicted to purple finds the color slipping through its fingers, slowly, stubbornly. Like a dye that just won't cling to fabric anymore. But for now, breathe in. There's vinegar in the air and something else, something salty, ancient, and almost sacred. The smell of history, maybe. Or just a lot of sun-roasted mollusk. Either way, welcome to the beginning of Byzantium's most peculiar fashion crisis. The sun has barely risen over the Aegean, but your nose is already deeply regretting your life choices. You're trudging barefoot along the muddy shoreline outside Tyre, once a Phoenician stronghold now firmly under Byzantine control, and in your hand is a long-handled wooden rake. Why? Because someone has to stir the mollusk vats. The dye works sit low along the rocky coast, half submerged, half rotting, and entirely unpleasant. You don't just smell the place, you feel it in your bones. A warm, fishy funk clings to your clothes like an angry ghost. You step carefully between ceramic vats the size of bathtubs, each one filled with thousands of broken snail shells and that infamous gooey secretion. The mixture bubbles sluggishly in the sun. If you listen closely, it hisses. This isn't a place for poetry. It's a place for purple. The process is brutal. After harvesting the murex snails, the workers crush them, some with mallets, some with stone wheels, and extract the hypobranchial gland. It's as tiny and slippery as it sounds. You need upwards of 10,000 snails for enough dye to color just one toga. The math gets worse if you want an entire ceremonial robe. The glands are soaked, strained, and left to ferment. This stage is critical. Get the timing wrong and the color shifts too far toward brown, toward red, toward something unworthy of an emperor's hem. The dye maker must know how to read the bubbles, sniff the air, and even track the moon. Folklore says that dye fermented under a full moon runs brighter. Science has politely declined to confirm this, but it does sound romantic. And so does the secrecy. Purple, you see, is state business. The Byzantines didn't just guard the recipe, they weaponized it. Entire generations of dyers were sworn to secrecy under pain of imprisonment or worse. A disgruntled worker caught selling a small flask of imperial dye to a Persian ambassador gone, possibly tossed into one of the vats himself. The dye wasn't just expensive, it was sacred, holy, political. Some scholars even compare the secrecy around Tyrian purple to early espionage networks. One 10th-century account describes purple inspectors dispatched by the emperor to ensure that no unauthorized dye-making took place. These guys had the authority to enter homes, monasteries, and marketplaces, sniff out illegal color operations, and confiscate clothing. You can almost imagine them smug in their government-issued cloaks, also purple, of course. And here's where things get weird. There's speculation that the Byzantines deliberately faked the loss of certain dye recipes to ensure no one else could replicate them. Whether that's true or just a bit of early Byzantine conspiracy theory remains up for debate. What is clear is that the recipe itself was nearly impossible to duplicate without hands-on experience. Even if you knew the type of snail, the gland, the fermenting time, you still needed the right sea temperature, the right sun exposure, the right instincts. This wasn't modern chemistry. It was centuries of gut feeling. One historian refers to it as industrial alchemy, which is possibly the most generous way to describe an operation that mostly involves smashing sea creatures and trusting your nose. But you keep working, stirring the sludge. Nearby, another worker drops a large sack of freshly harvested snails, the kind that look like little conch shells with an attitude problem. You glance at the mountains of discarded shells behind you, dunes of white and lavender stained with old dye buzzing with flies. You wonder what the coastline looked like before all of this, before the empire decided that purple was worth pillaging for. A seagull screams overhead. It sounds like judgment. You notice something peculiar. A man in richer clothes, maybe a tax official inspecting a finished bolt of cloth. He rubs it between his fingers, nods, then sniffs it. Yes, sniffs it. That's how you check for authenticity. True Tyrian purple has a smell musky, briny, unmistakable. Knockoff dyes, especially those made inland with plant-based pigments, lack the, shall we say, snailiness. Here's a strange tidbit. Some counterfeits would even soak their fabrics in fish oil to imitate the smell. This worked about as well as you'd expect your average connoisseur could tell the difference, but it was enough to fool an untrained merchant, or a bishop on a tight budget. And that's the thing, purple wasn't just fashion, it was legitimacy. If an emperor couldn't afford or acquire Tyrian dye, rivals could, and often did, use that as ammunition. He's not in purple, they'd whisper. Maybe he's not truly chosen. Historians still argue whether this symbolic weight was more important than military power in some centuries. But one thing's for sure, no purple, no peace. Your arms ache, the dye's nearly ready. A heavy wooden press is lowered to strain the liquid, and you watch as it pools thick, reddish-black, dark as wine in candlelight. Over the next few days, it'll oxidize and turn purple. The transformation is strangely beautiful, almost magical. A reminder that for all the stink and slog, something rare and radiant comes out of this mess. A visiting scholar once wrote that watching Tyrian purple develop was like seeing God write in color. You wouldn't go that far, but you do pause to admire it, this strange gift of snails and sun and salt and patience. Still, the dye vats are fewer than last year, the snails harder to find, and rumors circulate whispers in the marketplace that up north the royal robes are fading faster than they should. That maybe, just maybe, the Empire's grip on the color is weakening. But you keep stirring. For now, purple still reigns. You're back in Constantinople, and the change in atmosphere is immediate. No more coastal stink, no more crusty vats of fermented snail goo. Here the streets are stone-paved and shaded, the breeze cool off the Bosphorus. The city breathes with imperial pride. Traders, pilgrims, scribes, all moving with purpose, all darting glances toward the palace at the heart of it all, where purple doesn't just decorate, it dominates. Today you're on delivery duty. The bolt of freshly dyed cloth, still faintly smelling of its marine origins, is wrapped in linen and tucked under your arm. You navigate your way through the palace gates, nodding nervously at guards in scale armor, and enter the reception hall of the Chrysotriklinos, the Golden Hall. This is where emperors hold court, and where every curtain and cushion practically shouts in Tyrian tones. You try not to trip over your own feet. The cloth is for a new set of vestments. Ceremonial robes to be worn at Easter Mass, designed not only to awe the public but to remind every bishop, bureaucrat, and backstabbing cousin who really owns this city. And again, it's not the embroidery, the fit, or even the gold thread that matters most. It's the color. You hand the cloth to a eunuch, one of the high-ranking officials, his face unreadable, and he nods. No words. He disappears through a heavy door. You're left blinking in a corridor lit with small oil lamps and a soft echo of chanting from the chapel next door. You linger, pretending to adjust your sandals and soak it in the power, the luxury, the sheer drama of a place that believes deeply in color as authority. But here's the thing, it's not just the emperor in purple anymore. The dye is slipping. Not just out of fashion, but out of control. Over the last few decades, more and more elites, senators, generals, even provincial governors have begun flaunting garments dyed in suspiciously purple hues, some subtle, others brazen. One guy in Antioch was caught wearing a full-length purple tunic to a dinner party. Another was buried in purple shrouds. Yes, buried. The court was not amused. There are legal responses, of course. Edicts from the Basilica reasserting that true purple is reserved for the emperor and select clergy. Punishments for violators range from stiff fines to public shaming to, in one famous case, exile to a rock somewhere in the Black Sea. A dry one, with no snails. But as enforcement slips, so does the meaning. When too many people wear the forbidden color, it becomes diluted. Not just literally, though many of these imitator dyes are paler and cheaper, but symbolically. Purple becomes less sacred, more fashionable. Historians still argue whether this democratization of color was a symptom of imperial decline or one of its causes. Did the weakening of symbolic boundaries hasten the crumbling of authority? Or was it just an inevitable result of a globalizing economy? One where silk from China, dyes from India, and cotton from Egypt flooded the market and muddied the old standards. And here's a fringe tidbit for you. A few enterprising merchants began marketing Eastern Purple, a cheaper dye from lichens and berries, as morally safe. It looked close enough, smelled far better, and didn't get you arrested. The church, always fans of a good loophole, adopted this version for lower-level clergy. Meanwhile, real Tyrian purple continued to be hoarded, rationed, and mythologized. When the emperor commissioned new military banners, they were soaked in the darkest purples the palace could find, meant to blind enemies with splendor before a sword was even drawn. An enemy general once remarked, "I knew we'd lost when their flag shimmered like a bruised sky." But again, behind the scenes, the supply chain was faltering. The snail beds near Tyre were exhausted. Harvesting trips grew longer, costlier. A pirate raid off Cyprus disrupted a year's supply. Smugglers, yes, snail smugglers, began operating under the radar, moving crates of mollusks across borders. There's even a report from a court historian that a rival city-state tried to kidnap a dye master, like literally dragged him off a boat in the middle of the night. And all the while, the emperor's robes grew thinner, the purple paler, the symbolism shakier. You head home, walking through the Forum of Constantine, where merchants hawk glass beads, stale honey cakes, and knockoff perfume. You pass a shop selling scraps of dyed cloth, some purple, some indigo, some suspiciously gray. A child waves a flag made of plum-colored linen. You wince. It looks imperial. But no one seems to care. You wonder, did the emperor see this coming? Did he imagine a day when his sacred hue would be sewn into table runners? A man in a dusty tunic bumps into you. You apologize. He laughs. "Careful," he says. "That cloth smells like power." You nod. But the scent is fading. You're in a dimly lit scriptorium now, an imperial workshop where tired monks, scribes, and miniature painters hunch over vellum and parchment, copying old knowledge into new manuscripts. It smells of ink and beeswax and slightly burned candle wicks. You're not here to write. You're here for a strange, secretive job mixing purple ink. Yes, ink. Not dye for robes, not pigment for walls, ink for imperial books. Purple pages. It's one of those quiet eccentricities of Byzantine culture. Imagine opening a Bible and the pages themselves are deep violet, the letters gleaming gold. It's called a Codex Purpureus, and you're holding one gingerly wrapped in soft cloth like a baby with theological opinions. The emperor commissioned this book as a gift for the patriarch. Naturally, it had to be extra. The calfskin was soaked in purple dye, dried in shade, and then written on with gold leaf. Some pages include silver script. The effect? Otherworldly. You stare down at words shimmering like stars on twilight skies. Try not to drool. It's fine parchment. But here's the twist. The purple ink you're asked to help prepare today is not made from murex. It's made from bugs. Yes, bugs, specifically the Kermes beetle, a tiny parasitic insect found on Mediterranean oak trees. Crushed, dried, and steeped, they give off a red-pink pigment that, if treated carefully, can mimic Tyrian purple. Not perfectly, but convincingly, especially on paper. This bug-based purple was never quite holy enough for imperial clothing, but in books, it's the workaround of choice. Some Byzantine scholars even claimed Kermes ink had divine warmth. Others just liked that it didn't require snail guts or the smell of low tide. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of purple ink in imperial scriptoria was a sign of artistic innovation or just a desperate pivot when dye supplies dried up. Whatever the reason, it gave rise to some of the most beautiful manuscripts in history, scrolls and codices where theology met pageantry in a swirl of violet and gold. And it wasn't just Bibles. Letters to foreign dignitaries were sometimes written on purple paper, diplomatic flexing at its finest. You can picture a Persian ambassador unrolling a scroll, catching the glint of gold on plum-colored vellum and immediately understanding, this guy means business. But making the ink is no picnic. You crush the beetles, add vinegar mix with gum arabic, and heat it just shy of boiling. Then stir, and stir, and stir. And keep stirring. The master of ink growls his breath, a mix of cloves and disappointment. He's been doing this for 30 years. You ask him if he remembers the days when real Tyrian dye was easy to get. He snorts. Easy. We used to beg for scraps from the dyers. One time I traded a salter for a teaspoon of the stuff. You both laugh. You think he's joking. You hope he's joking. And here's an odd little tidbit. There's a rumor that one imperial copyist became so obsessed with purple ink that he dyed his own robes to match his manuscripts. Got him kicked out of the order. He now lives alone in a cave near Bithynia, writing poetry on lavender bark. No one has verified this, but it's become a favorite cautionary tale among scribes. Don't go full purple. Later, as the sun sets, you step outside to air out your tunic. It's picked up a sweet, earthy tint from the beetle ink. On the nearby hill, you spot another scribe dumping leftover parchment scraps into a brazier. Little puffs of violet smoke drift skyward, oddly pretty in the golden light. Nearby, an elderly monk is illuminating a capital letter V. The border is violet, the inner letter gold, and tiny animals march along the margin: peacocks, lions, rabbits, none of them purple. He sighs, brushes a speck of dust off the page, and leans closer. "Do you think the emperor actually reads these?" he murmurs. You shake your head. Probably not, but the patriarch will. He says. Then I'll make the next peacock wink. You smile and walk on. That's the thing about imperial purple, it doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through books, through ink, through little gestures no one notices, unless they're really looking. And maybe that's how purple survives, not just in the robes of emperors or the veils of bishops, but in the margin of a letter, in the pigment of a forgotten manuscript, in the strange dedication of men who crush beetles for the love of beauty. The empire is shifting, the robes are fading. But tonight the ink glows like twilight fire, and the scribe keeps painting. You're waking up with the city now, just barely. The first traders are rattling their carts over uneven stones. The air still smells like last night's oil lamps, and there's a faint breeze off the sea, stirring smoke and gossip in equal measure. You're heading uphill this time to the palace of the Porphyrogenity. Yes, that means born in the purple. A fancy way of saying this is where imperial babies come from. It's not a maternity ward in the modern sense. It's a chamber deep within the palace, painted with frescoes tiled in cool marbles, and most crucially decorated with as much purple as possible. Not just cloth or banners, the stone itself. You run your fingers along the walls. Smooth, cold porphyry, a rare volcanic rock shot through with purplish-red crystals shipped all the way from Egypt. Harder than granite, absurdly expensive, and almost impossible to carve. But oh, does it glow. When the sun hits it just right, it seems to hum. The whole idea was this: if a child was born in this special chamber surrounded by purple stone and royal midwives, they were considered a true imperial heir, porphyrogenitos, literally born in the purple. Not just royal by blood, but sanctified by geography, by architecture, by color. You'd think this would simplify succession, right? Nope. Byzantine politics being what they are, it just gave people another thing to argue about. Sure, he's the emperor's son, one faction might grumble, but was he born in the purple? No, another might whisper his mother gave birth while on campaign. In an olive grove. Scandalous. Historians still argue whether the porphyry chamber was ever used for every imperial birth, or just the especially political ones. Some sources suggest it was often locked and unused. Others claim the midwives had to wear purple gloves while delivering. One fringe theory even insists the room's acoustics were specially designed to enhance the baby's first cry. Slightly unlikely, delightfully weird. But the symbolism mattered. A porphyrogenitos prince had an aura, a kind of mythic legitimacy that made assassins hesitate and bishops fall silent. Even rebels who claimed the throne often tried to fake or forge their own purple birth stories. One guy from Trebizond claimed his mother gave birth next to a plum tree under an imperial tent. Close enough. You sit now on a low bench pretending to polish a brass lamp while eavesdropping on a wet nurse humming lullabies. A pair of older noblewomen discuss a recent birth. The mother, a minor cousin of the emperor. The baby, male. The location, not the porphyry chamber. Tisk, tisk. He'll never be more than a strategos, one of them mutters. But here's the catch: the dye is running out even for these ceremonial rooms. Much of the actual purple in these chambers isn't Tyrian purple anymore. It's a mix of cheaper stones, faded wall hangings, and polished paints. When a recent wall mural began to peel, it revealed a previous layer underneath painted blue, not purple, likely due to a mid-century shortage. Embarrassing. The porphyry blocks themselves, once shipped by imperial decree from far-off Egypt, are no longer being mined. Some were repurposed from old Roman monuments. Others were acquired from pagan temples, chipped out and shipped north by sweaty teams of laborers under guard. You imagine the conversation. This slab looks purple enough, right? Close one eye, squint. Yeah, we'll call it sacred. In the far corner of the room stands a porphyry basin where babies were once ritually bathed. These days it holds potted lilies. You're told an artisan was hired last month to repaint the ceiling stars in a more imperial hue. He ran out of pigment halfway through and substituted local ochre. You stare up. Sure enough, half the stars shimmer violet. The other half, mustard yellow. Nobody mentions it aloud. That's the strange thing about purple in Byzantium. It's wholly untouchable, reserved for the few, and yet constantly leaking into everything. Seeping into birth rooms, into mosaics, into stories whispered over soup. Everyone wants a piece of it, even if they have to fake it. And you still have purple dust under your fingernails from the scriptorium yesterday. You flick it off and head down the corridor past a column that's been carefully wrapped in violet silk. A servant straightens the fabric. Doesn't match the original, he says. You nod, but it's close enough. And so the purple survives not because it's always authentic, but because no one dares admit when it isn't. You find yourself walking toward the sea, now pulled by the scent of salt and a certain fishy aroma that clings to the docks of Constantinople like gossip clings to court servants. Your destination isn't the harbor itself, it's tucked just behind it in a part of the city most nobles pretend doesn't exist, the dye workers' quarter. Welcome to the pungent underworld of Imperial Purple's origin story. It's loud, it's smoky, it's full of buckets, brine, and bad tempers. This is where the magic or the mess really begins. Because before emperors wore purple robes, before scribes inked gilded letters on dyed vellum, someone had to extract that color from a sea snail. Yes, a sea snail. The murex. And not just any snail. Murex brandaris and Murex trunculus, to be precise. You probably wouldn't notice them on a beach, spiny, unassuming little things. But inside each snail, deep in its glands, lies a teensy drop of yellowish fluid. When exposed to light, it turns purple, eventually. After fermenting, for days, in vats, in heat. Yes, this is why it smells so potent here. Some ancient Roman sources said you could smell a purple dye factory from several miles away, and you'd believe it. Your nostrils protest. Even your shoes feel offended. You pass a stone basin where dozens of snails are being cracked open by a young apprentice with a flat rock. He hums to himself, fingers stained a faint gray purple. His hands smell like the inside of Poseidon's laundry basket. There's a common myth that a single toga required 10,000 snails to die. The real number, historians still argue. Some say 2,000. Others suggest it could go as high as 12,000 depending on the intensity. What they all agree on, it took a horrifying number of snails. One Byzantine writer called it the royal stench of empire. And no, you couldn't just add the snails to a boiling pot and walk away. The extraction required delicate timing, specific exposure to sunlight, and here's the best part: fermentation in urine. Yes, human urine. Kept in clay jars under very patient supervision. Imperial robes didn't just reek of power, they reeked of pee and seawater. The dye masters here guard their recipes like family secrets. Some say vinegar improves the purple. Others insist on adding fig leaves. One old man claims it only works properly if you sing to the snails. No one listens to him, but oddly his batches come out the most vibrant. You step into a dye workshop where rows of wool hang like limp ghosts, swaying gently in the sea breeze. The deeper shades of purple, almost black, are for the highest offices. The lighter pinkish hues reserved for minor nobles, bishops, and guys pretending to be more important than they are. Here's a quirky fact. One Byzantine law dictated that only the emperor could wear robes dyed entirely in Tyrian purple. Everyone else had to settle for stripes trim or purple-adjacent blends. Naturally, people cheated. Tailors learned to mix murex with madder root or blend in crushed Kermes beetles. The result, a knockoff so convincing, it took expert eyes to catch. One court spy's job was simply identifying illegal purples. Imperial hue enforcement. You wonder if they had badges. You pause beside a vat where linen is soaking in a thick purplish stew. It bubbles faintly. The dye master stirs it with a stick, eyes narrowed like a suspicious grandmother at a family wedding. Too hot, he mutters. If it's too hot, it browns. If it browns, it stains the wrong way. Then you get plum, not purple. You nod solemnly. The shame of plum. He lets you dip your finger in. It's warm, thick, and sticky. You lift your hand and watch the liquid shift colors as it dries in the sun from greenish to blue to deep violet. It's a tiny alchemy. And here's the real kicker: this dye was once worth more than gold. Literally. In its heyday, Tyrian purple sold for its weight in solid gold coins. That's why smuggling snails or dye recipes was considered treason. A dye worker who revealed secrets to enemy states beheaded. One who spilled dye on a non-imperial tunic, whipped. One who tried to open a rival factory outside the city walls vanished. Still, the empire tried to keep up production for centuries. But it's not sustainable. The snails are harder to find. The fermentation is inconsistent. The smell is, well, still here. You watch as a tired young woman wrings out a piece of wool, her hands raw from salt and lime. She sneezes. The apprentice hands her a damp cloth. Neither speaks. And yet you get it. This whole place stinks literally and metaphorically, but it's also sacred. This is where emperors' robes begin, where purple is born, not in palaces, not in prayer, but in guts and grime by the hands of tired people who will never wear it. You turn to leave and nearly trip over a bucket labeled Royal Batch. Do not drink. Fair warning. As you step back into the salty sunlight, the breeze catches a freshly dyed sash drying on the line. It flutters like a flag. Deep, impossible purple. The kind you'd fight for. The kind you'd fake a birth certificate for. The kind no one forgets. And it all came from a snail. You follow a winding alley uphill from the dye vats, the stench slowly giving way to warm bread, roasting chestnuts, and the occasional squawk from a rooftop chicken. The rhythm of the city softens here, narrower streets, shaded courtyards, quieter voices. You're entering the world of imperial tailors, and yes, they take themselves very seriously. This isn't your average linen shop. You're not buying pillowcases or tunics for toddlers. These are the workshops where the paludamentum, the ceremonial cloak of the emperor, is assembled, where every pleat has political weight, every stitch is sewn with a whisper of divine legitimacy. You duck through a stone archway and find yourself in a long room with high latticed windows. The light falls in dappled patches across spools of thread bolts of silk and brass embroidery, hoops the size of dinner plates. It smells of beeswax, cedar, and ambition. A tailor is crouched on the floor, unraveling golden thread, actual gold by the way, pounded flat into ribbons and wrapped around silk. He's muttering to himself about cuff width. You lean closer. Too wide and he'll look like a barbarian. Too tight and he can't bless anyone. Ah yes, the classic problem of sacred tailoring. Across the room, a pair of older women are stitching pearls onto a hem. Real pearls. Tiny chalk white, each chosen for uniform size and shine. It'll take them 3 weeks to finish one robe. They haven't looked up once. Don't sneeze, one whispers. Sneezed last week, the other replies. Still finding pearls in my sandals. It's easy to forget, amid the scent of mulled wine and the hum of silk being drawn taut, that this delicate work is part of a broader imperial machinery. These robes aren't just decorative, they're legal weapons. They communicate rank allegiance, divine favor, even punishment. That stripe of purple on the shoulder, a sign you outrank most of the Senate. The double row of eagle embroidery, a nod to ancient Rome. The clasp style recently updated after that cousin tried to declare himself emperor in Antioch. Didn't go well. Historians still argue whether the more intricate designs were actually seen by the general public. Most citizens never got closer than a glimpse at festivals. But rumors swirled. Some claimed the emperor's robe had a dragon stitched along the hem. Others said the purple shimmered even in the dark. One fringe chronicler even suggested the robe sang softly at night, probably just the wind in the banners, but fun to imagine. You run your fingers along a bolt of silk, dyed deep purple. Not Tyrian, but a blend with indigo and mulberry. Looks close enough unless you hold it side by side with the real thing, and no one in this room plans on doing that. A young assistant rushes in with a scroll. New measurements for the basileus, she announces out of breath. He's grown again. There's a collective groan. The tailor mutters something about imperial pastries. You learn that robes must be adjusted constantly, not just for waistlines, but for omens. If a comet appears, switch to the lion pattern. If a plague strikes, replace gold thread with white, a symbol of purity. If a general returns victorious, add laurels. If he returns defeated, quietly snip them off before anyone notices. One tailor admits, half laughing, that they once re-embroidered the same robe 3 times in a month each time, because the emperor's astrologer changed his predictions. Mercury in retrograde. Add a phoenix. Mars rising. Swap it for a crossbow. Poor Mars never stood a chance. You're shown a rarely seen ceremonial robe kept in a cedar-lined chest. The purple is nearly black with age, the gold thread dulled but still catching the sun. There's a stitched inscription in Greek. The world bends not to iron but to thread. That's the core of it, isn't it? The Byzantines didn't just rule by sword or scripture. They ruled by spectacle, by textile, by the quiet power of garments so carefully made, so richly symbolic that no one dared question their authority. Except, of course, when they did. Because here's the awkward truth. As purple dye became scarce, so did the robe's authority. Imposters began cropping up, not just wearing purple, but claiming whole closets of imperial regalia. One warlord in Cappadocia commissioned his own basileus robe, complete with fake pearl shoulder pads and painted-on embroidery. When the emperor heard about it, he didn't send soldiers. He sent tailors and had them present the man with a real imperial tunic. Within a week, the warlord was a loyal governor, bribed by fashion. You step outside the workshop, now blinking against the sun. The air is quieter here. A child runs past with a purple ribbon tied around their wrist. Not real purple, of course, just dyed flax. But it flutters like something sacred. You realize something strange in Byzantium purple isn't just a color. It's a language, one you wear stitch guard, or if you're feeling bold, forge. And whether it's snails or silk or stitched sunbursts, the message is the same. We are divine, and you are not. You're no longer in the city now. You've followed a caravan road inland, dusty, sun-washed, lined with cypress trees and the occasional startled goat. You're traveling toward a lesser-known region of the Byzantine Empire where dye is scarce, but ambition is not. Your destination, a provincial palace, and the site of one of the empire's more uncomfortable fashion crises. You arrive just as the local governor, or strategos, is preparing for a diplomatic visit. He greets you in a courtyard paved with worn marble tiles, fidgeting nervously with the hem of his robe. His problem, as he confesses with a sheepish grin, is that he has no purple, at least not the right kind. You look him over. His robe is a little too red, more plum chutney than imperial violet. He's clearly hoping the sunlight will wash it out. Think it'll pass, he asks, then quickly answers himself. No, they'll notice. Because here's the thing. While Constantinople's tailors and dyers guarded their secrets, the empire was vast, and dye scarcity created what we might gently call a fashion hierarchy of lies. Purple became a spectrum of compromises. In places like this, hours from the capital, governors improvised. Beet juice, boiled lichens, crushed berries, iron oxide, whatever could mimic that elusive hue. It was the historical equivalent of wearing a knockoff designer handbag and hoping no one checks the stitching. You're ushered inside for a closer look at the provincial wardrobe. The palace staff leads you to a chamber that smells faintly of lavender and candle soot. Garments hang on wooden racks, some faded, some fraying, all trying very hard to look important. The newest robe was dyed with imported Phoenician pigment, which turns out to be fermented cabbage and vinegar. It smells accordingly. Another piece reserved for festivals is suspiciously blue. A third has gold trim stitched over what is unmistakably burlap. A court scribe hunched over a scroll of protocols reminds everyone that the basileus prefers darker tones. There is much nodding. A servant is dispatched to re-dye something immediately. You can hear the panic in their footsteps. There's a peculiar story about a similar governor 2 centuries earlier who attempted to hand-tint his robe using squid ink. It looked spectacular in the candlelight, then horrifying under the sun. The ink ran down his legs during a procession. He claimed it was a symbol of divine humility. No one believed him. This desperate improvisation became a quiet crisis for the empire. Purple was supposed to mean power, unity, legitimacy, but now it meant logistics. If a governor couldn't get the real stuff, did he still count? Could a robe dyed with onions hold the same authority? Historians still argue whether provincial officials lost power partly because of these symbolic failures. Some claim it was trade routes collapsing. Others say it was bad management. But there's an oddly compelling theory: when you look, silly people stop listening. One fringe scholar even proposed that several minor revolts began in part because rival governors accused each other of wearing the wrong purple. The footnotes are sketchy, but it's fun to imagine. Back in the palace, you are shown the ceremonial vestments chest where emergency robes are kept. The lid creaks open with theatrical dread. Inside, one tunic dyed with mulberry and fish scales one stole that smells like incense and soup, and a crown made of dyed goose feathers glued to wood. You offer a diplomatic smile. They have texture. The Strategos groans, "We're doomed." But even here, far from the Murex vats and palace tailors, people cling to the myth. A teenage servant leans in to whisper that her grandmother once saw real purple at a market in Antioch, and that it shimmered like a pool of wine under moonlight. Maybe it's true. Maybe not. Doesn't matter. The belief alone gives it power. You step out into the courtyard again, where a tailor is trying to catch sunlight on a newly dyed sash, tilting it like a wine glass. The color decidedly raspberry. Still, the governor will wear it. He'll step out, smile broadly, and hope the visiting dignitaries don't look too closely. Because in Byzantium, as in all great empires, sometimes confidence counts more than color fastness. You mount your horse and look back at the palace. From a distance, the robes almost pass. The gold thread catches the light. The purple looks close enough. And maybe that's the real legacy of the empire's purple problem, the slow, quiet shift from substance to spectacle, from snails to symbolism, from actual imperial dye to whatever you can fake convincingly. After all, when the real thing runs out, you just squint and call it tradition. You ride away from the provincial palace, the scent of wild thyme and dry earth lingering in the air. Your thoughts drift back to those elusive purple robes, their shimmering threads, and the curious power they held. But now your journey leads you to a bustling port city, a place where imperial ambition meets the messy reality of trade and politics. Here, the Byzantine Empire's purple dye didn't just arrive magically. It was the result of a sprawling network of merchants, sailors, and middlemen, each playing their part in a complex and delicate dance. You're about to step into the noisy, salty world of Byzantine trade routes and the purple supply chain. The harbor buzzes with activity. Wooden ships creak, ropes snap taut, and merchants shout over the clamoring crowds. Barrels of goods are unloaded, and you spot crates marked with the imperial eagle. This is where purple meets the world. You wander toward a dye merchant's stall where you see piles of dried murex shells, the source of the coveted dye. The merchant, a wiry man with a sun-leathered face, explains that it takes thousands of these tiny sea snails to produce just an ounce of true Tyrian purple. The process is painstaking. Snails are collected, crushed, and their secretions carefully extracted and exposed to sunlight to develop that iconic color. The smell, by the way, is less than pleasant, something like rotten fish mixed with vinegar. You wrinkle your nose and wonder how anyone convinced themselves this was worth it. The merchant laughs and says, "You get used to it, or you become a tailor." Behind the scenes, this trade was fraught with danger. Pirates lurked along the Mediterranean, eager to seize precious cargo. Rival states coveted the secret of the purple dye, and sometimes ships laden with murex were sunk or stolen. Smugglers tried to pass off inferior dyes dyed with cheaper materials, and authorities struggled to enforce the imperial monopoly on purple garments. You overhear a conversation about a recent scandal, a merchant accused of selling fake purple robes to a local noble, the punishment, public humiliation, and forced dyeing in the harbor's foul waters. Historians still argue whether these harsh measures were effective deterrents or merely political theater. On a lighter note, there's a quirky story about a dye master who accidentally dyed his own beard purple during a particularly long workday. He walked the city for weeks before anyone noticed, earning him the nickname the Lavender Sage. As you explore further, you find evidence of how deeply purple was woven into Byzantine life, not just in clothing, but in ceremonies, religious vestments, and even currency. The color was a symbol of divine right and earthly power, a constant reminder that the wearer was touched by the gods themselves. You pause to watch a group of dock workers unloading a crate stamped with the emperor's seal. Inside are bolts of freshly dyed silk destined for the imperial wardrobe. The colors are vivid, glowing softly in the afternoon sun. As the sun sets, painting the harbor gold and purple, you realize the true story of Byzantine purple isn't just about dye or robes, it's about people. Ambition and artistry, commerce and secrecy, loyalty and deception, all tangled together in a story as rich and complex as the color itself. You breathe in the salty air, feeling the weight of history settle gently around you. The empire's purple legacy is not just a color, but a world made vibrant by the threads of human endeavor. You leave the bustling port behind, the fading cries of seagulls mixing with the gentle splash of waves against the stone quay. Your path now leads inland to the grand Byzantine court itself, a place where purple wasn't just a color, but a language spoken fluently in ceremonies, decrees, and secret glances. The palace rises before you, an imposing labyrinth of marble halls, gilded ceilings, and mosaics that catch the flicker of torchlight like stars. You find yourself in the throne room, where the emperor presides over his court in a robe so deeply dyed in Tyrian purple that it almost seems to absorb the light around him. This room breathes power. The emperor's purple isn't just about wealth, it's about divine sanction. You lean in to catch the hushed whispers about the purple-born claim, a belief that those who wore imperial purple carried a fragment of the god's authority. Court rituals follow a precise choreography, and the emperor's robe plays a starring role. You watch courtiers bow and scrape their eyes, flicking to the shimmering silk as if it were a living thing. The robe is said to be woven with threads blessed by priests, and legends whisper it grants the wearer wisdom and protection, though historians still argue whether these were symbolic or sincere beliefs. Behind the scenes, tailors and priests guarded these garments jealously. You hear about an infamous incident when a rival faction tried to steal the emperor's purple cloak during a festival. The theft was foiled by palace guards, but not before panic rippled through the court like wildfire. The color purple, you realize, was a kind of political armor, fragile, costly, and fiercely protected. It separated rulers from subjects, insiders from outsiders. Wearing it was both a privilege and a burden. You step into a quieter chamber where imperial garments are stored. Here you see robes not only dyed in purple, but adorned with gold and precious stones, each symbol carefully chosen to convey messages of power, piety, or military prowess. An old courtier with eyes twinkling behind thick glasses shares a curious tidbit. Emperors often had multiple identical robes made just in case one was damaged or lost. He jokes that some were probably just excuses to keep tailors employed. As you prepare to leave, you overhear a whispered debate among courtiers about a controversial new dye formula rumored to rival the original Murex purple. Purists decried it as heresy. Progressives saw it as salvation for a dwindling resource. Historians still debate if this innovation marked the beginning of the empire's slow fading or a creative adaptation to change. Walking away from the throne room, you notice a small boy tugging at the sleeve of a nobleman's robe, fascinated by the intricate embroidery. The nobleman smiles and whispers, "Remember, purple is more than color. It is history woven into cloth." You nod, feeling the weight of centuries wrapped gently around you like a well-worn cloak. In Byzantium, purple was never just fabric, it was the empire itself, a symbol woven from ambition, art, and human desire. You leave the grand halls of the imperial palace, stepping into the quieter, shadowed streets of Constantinople as twilight settles. The purple glow of sunset seems to echo the imperial hue, reminding you that purple's influence seeped far beyond the palace walls. You find yourself wandering into the neighborhoods where artisans, merchants, and everyday folk live their lives, each touched in some way by the empire's obsession with purple. In a small workshop, a dyer carefully tends vats filled with a strange bubbling liquid. You peer inside to see the famed Murex dye in various stages of transformation, from the raw snail secretions to the deep, rich purple prized by emperors. The dyer explains how the process was a closely guarded secret passed down through generations, and how even slight variations in timing or sunlight exposure could dramatically change the color. You watch as assistants dip silk threads, then hang them out in the sun to fix the color. The air smells pungent, a mix of saltwater algae and the faint sharpness of vinegar. It's not a smell for the faint-hearted, yet it created beauty beyond measure. Curiously, you hear a story about how some dyers tried to substitute snail secretions with plant-based dyes when supplies ran low. These alternatives never quite matched the brilliance of true purple, but were used during times of shortage or war. Historians still debate whether these substitutions contributed to the dye's eventual decline or helped sustain the tradition longer than expected. Nearby, a group of apprentices laugh quietly as one of them experiments with an ancient recipe involving crushed shellfish and lemon juice aiming for the perfect hue. The dyer warns them that some colors are too purple for this world, hinting at superstitions that swirled around the dye's mysterious origins. You realize the trade wasn't just about color, it was a delicate dance of chemistry, artistry, and folklore. The dye was a living tradition intertwined with the lives of those who made it and those who wore it. As night falls, you step outside the workshop to find the city illuminated by lanterns casting soft amber light. The purple of dusk fades, but its legacy lingers in the streets, in the markets, and in the hearts of Byzantium's people. You pause, letting the gentle hum of the city night wash over you. Purple was more than a pigment. It was a story of human ingenuity, culture, and the relentless pursuit of beauty. You drift away from the city's glow now, following a quieter path leading toward the empire's religious heart, where purple wasn't just imperial, but sacred. The great Byzantine churches rise before you, their domes shimmering with gold mosaics and intricate frescoes that tell stories as old as time. Inside one such basilica, you find yourself surrounded by incense smoke and the low murmur of chanting monks. Purple here is more than royalty. It's a symbol of the divine woven into the vestments of priests and bishops who bridge heaven and earth. You notice a richly embroidered stole hanging near the altar, its fabric dyed in that unmistakable deep purple. The priest explains that the color represents penitence and preparation, worn especially during Lent and important ceremonies. This purple, unlike the imperial robe, speaks of humility and devotion, a paradox that fascinates you. The dye's sacred role extends to relics and altar cloths, sanctified to emphasize their holiness. You learn that the church sometimes clashed with imperial authorities over who could wear purple and when. Purple was a color of power, yes, but also of spiritual authority. One curious story surfaces: a bishop who was accused of wearing imperial purple robes during a procession, causing a scandal that rippled through the city. Some saw it as a bold statement of church supremacy, others an overreach of spiritual power. Historians still argue whether this incident signaled the beginning of a shifting balance between church and state. You watch the flicker of candlelight on the mosaics, imagining how many hands had created this sacred space. The purple robes worn here weren't just fashion, they were woven prayers, symbols of a faith that sustained an empire. Interestingly, there's a legend that the murex dye itself was considered a divine gift, its origins tied to mythical sea creatures and ancient gods. Some fringe scholars even suggest the purple dye had mystical properties, though most agree this was more about metaphor than magic. As the choir's voices rise, you feel the gentle weight of centuries pressing around you. Purple in Byzantium was layered royal and religious, worldly and spiritual, a color that carried stories of power, faith, and identity in every thread. You leave the basilica, the scent of incense lingering like a soft memory. Outside, the night is quiet, the stars twinkling like scattered jewels against the velvet sky. And somewhere in that vast ancient empire, purple continues to glow, faint but eternal. You step out of the hushed basilica into the cooler evening air, heading now toward the quieter corners of Byzantine life, where purple touched the everyday rather than the exalted. You stroll through markets filled with the hum of vendors, children playing, and the occasional stray cat weaving through the crowd. Purple dye wasn't only for emperors and priests. Wealthy merchants, nobles, and officials all sought out purple textiles to display their status. Even small touches like a purple sash or embroidered trim could signal prestige. You observe a merchant carefully selecting a bolt of fabric, its subtle purple sheen catching the lantern light. The economics of purple dye reveal fascinating layers. The sheer cost of producing true Tyrian purple meant only the rich could afford it, making it a sort of ancient luxury brand. This exclusivity helped reinforce social hierarchies, turning purple into a kind of wearable social currency. You overhear a conversation about sumptuary laws, regulations that restricted who could wear purple or other luxurious colors. These laws were strict but inconsistently enforced, leading to both resentment and creative workarounds. Historians still debate how effective these laws really were in preserving purple's elite status. One charming anecdote comes from a provincial town where a wealthy widow reportedly had her servants dye her pet parrot's feathers purple just to keep up appearances during a festival. The bird became a local celebrity, though it reportedly hated the dye baths. You wander toward a quiet alley where a group of textile workers huddle around a fire repairing garments and swapping stories. They talk about the challenges of working with purple dye, the mess, the smell, and the constant pressure to maintain secrecy. Some say purple dye could stain the skin for days, leaving workers with permanent purple fingertips a badge of honor in their trade. You consider the political implications too. Purple was sometimes gifted as a diplomatic token or ransom payment, a symbol of respect or subjugation. Its value transcended mere fabric, acting as a currency of influence that could sway alliances or declare dominance. As you watch a craftsman carefully stitching purple thread into a tunic, you realize purple wasn't just a color of imperial or religious power, but a vibrant thread woven into the social fabric of Byzantine life itself. With the city settling into night, you find a quiet bench and sit for a moment, letting the gentle sounds of the evening wash over you. Purple had many faces in Byzantium, imperial, sacred, and social, a hue as rich and complex as the empire's own story. The soft murmur of the city fades behind you as you venture into the countryside, where the sprawling Byzantine Empire reveals another side of its purple story. You find yourself among fields where the humble murex snails once thrived, the very source of that legendary dye now threatened by changing tides and overharvesting. Here you walk along rocky shores dotted with snail shells, evidence of centuries of extraction. The labor was backbreaking, collecting tens of thousands of these tiny sea creatures to produce just a small quantity of dye. You imagine the hands calloused and stained of the workers who carried this out season after season. This rural setting also introduces you to the environmental impact of the purple dye industry. Over time, murex populations dwindled, and the delicate balance between nature and economy began to tip. Some scholars suggest that the empire's demand for purple contributed to ecological stress along the Mediterranean coast, although others argue that natural cycles played a greater role. You encounter local fishermen who tell tales passed down through generations, stories of how the sea once teemed with the creatures that made purple so rare and precious. One old man reminisces about the days when purple dye was plentiful enough for even villagers to wear faded sashes, a far cry from the imperial exclusivity. Curiously, you learn that during times of scarcity, the empire experimented with synthetic dyes and alternative methods, though none ever matched the prestige of the original murex purple. Some fringe theories even speculate that the dye's rarity was deliberately maintained to preserve its status, a fascinating intersection of economics and symbolism. As you walk past ancient quarries and abandoned workshops, the remnants of this industry whisper stories of ambition and decline. The dye that once wrapped emperors in glory now serves as a reminder of the impermanence of even the grandest empires. In this quiet, you reflect on how a simple color connected so many threads: people, power, nature, and history. The purple that once bathed the halls of Byzantium also stained the very earth beneath it, a vivid testament to human desire and its consequences. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of lavender and gold. You breathe deeply, feeling the cool breeze from the sea, a gentle farewell from the ancient world of purple dye. As night deepens, you find yourself back in the heart of the empire, surrounded by the lingering echoes of purple's grandeur. The tales you've gathered from imperial courts to humble dye workshops, from sacred basilicas to coastal fields, weave together into a tapestry as rich and complex as the hue itself. You consider how purple's legacy extends beyond Byzantium's fall. The color continued to symbolize power, luxury, and spirituality across Europe and beyond, its story passed down through art, literature, and tradition. Even today, purple's royal and religious associations trace back to those ancient snails and the empire's insatiable thirst for a color that was as rare as it was magnificent. You recall the whispered court intrigues, the meticulous dyeing processes, the laws restricting who might wear purple, and the environmental toll hidden beneath its beauty. Each element highlights a different facet of human ambition, creativity, and restraint. Historians still argue about the precise impact of the purple dye trade on Byzantium's economy and politics, whether it was a vital source of wealth or a luxury that hastened decline. Yet no matter the debate, purple remains a vivid symbol of an empire's glory and complexity. As you sit quietly, the city's soft night sounds a comforting backdrop. You let your thoughts drift. Purple is more than just a color. It's a story stitched into the fabric of history, a reminder of the delicate balance between nature, culture, and power. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let these stories carry you gently into rest. The Empire's purple glow fades into the night, but its legacy lingers in the quiet corners of your mind, wrapping you in a soothing, timeless embrace.